Hopefully. Brilliant. Right, a warm welcome to everybody. This is yet another, we've had a flurry in the last week of talks on the Agile series. The aim with these is to cover the various aspects of Agile working. We have two long-standing volunteers who've been absolute superstars in a number of projects, Esther and Jean. The format of this one is slightly different. We frame this as a bit more of a sort of discussion and talk. We would love to hear your views, and we would love if you have been working on any projects in the tech army and involved in any of this, please share your learnings. It's useful for people who haven't worked on anything yet to understand the various elements of things, and it really kind of hopefully helps cement some of the learnings and give you guys some insights into the various elements. I will start with an introduction to Jean and Esther themselves. They can give a bit of intro and background before we kind of go into a few. We've got 3 discussion points today, but equally if there's anything you guys want to throw into the mix, please do, because this session's really for you. Welcome. Right, Jean or Esther, who would like to go first? I've got Jean top left if we went in the Zoom box order, if that helps.
Okay.
On you go, Jean.
Okay. Sorry, do you want us to introduce ourselves?
Yeah, just everybody.
So my name is Jean Ferguson. I've been working in the corporate world for too long, like 30 or many years, and in business analysis first and process improvement, and then discovered Lean and fell in love with it because it's all about continuous improvement, which runs through my blood, and also respect for people, the way that you do improve. And I think that's probably enough. Esther.
Hi, so I've been working primarily in local government for nearly 20 years. I'm from a customer services background, so traditionally I worked in contact centres, and then I was the head of customer and digital at North Ayrshire Council, but decided that I would not go back after I had my second child. So I've been working independently for nearly 3 years now. I can't believe how quickly the time flies. And I tend to get involved in a wide variety of different things, but probably my main sort of skill, or the thing that I tend to get involved in, is trying to help organisations to get stuff done. So it's about like projects that are maybe stuck, or areas where people have maybe struggled to make progress, and trying to support organisations in identifying why that is and moving things on. Like Jean, I've probably used Lean quite extensively. And recently I did the PDA with Kim from Dundee and Angus. So I did the PDA in service design. So I probably use a combination of different tools to help whatever the client requirements is to get something done. I don't tend to be too precious about sticking to one particular approach or another. I try and blend things depending on what the need and the skills of the team are.
Brilliant. Thank you guys, and I really appreciate you giving your time to sort of talk with us all today. So service design itself has become really popular in recent years, and lean thinking's been around a hell of a lot longer. Where do you see the similarities between the two? Jean, do you want to?
They both focus on the customer. So Lean is all about flowing value to the customer, and it came out of a manufacturing background, but it's actually been applied in every sector in the world now, a lot in healthcare as well, which is sort of very different and very much a service. So it's about listening to your customer and understanding value from their perspective, not yours. And that's a really important thing. And service design is the same, because it's delivering good services from the point of view of the customer. What will the customer think a good service is? I'm sure you can all think of good services that you've had and absolutely awful services that you've had. Yeah.
So I suppose for me, probably the one thing that I always bang on about that both approaches really focus on is actually understanding what the problem is that you try and solve. So quite often I work with organisations, particularly with technical projects, where they've already picked a technology and they're trying to they're frantically looking around for a problem to shoehorn the technology into. And it's actually thinking about, well, what is the problem, and then linking that into the value around how is it going to make things better. I think it does take a brave person to admit that the project that you're working on is not going to make things better for anybody. But I think really being clear on that at the very beginning, and I'm a real evidence-based person, so I like to see, and I think if you think about the process that Lean follows, which is all about defining what the issue is and then using some time to sort of measure and analyse, and I think that the service design approach is really similar, so it's doing that bit up front where you're really looking at what the current situation is, speaking to both your users internally and externally, and then starting to think about what is that problem and what are the users telling us. So for me, it's very much about taking an evidence-based approach and no jumping to your own assumptions. And then finally, they both really focus on continuous improvement. So trying to make some improvement rather than focusing on something that's perfect, and then building on whatever that improvement actually is. So I think there's quite a lot of similarities between the two approaches, although arguably Lean's maybe more numbers based and the service design focuses on more qualitative stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I guess before I move into to another question I have, it might not be a bad idea. Lean isn't something people talk about as readily anymore, I don't think. And I guess for the sort of audience on the call, could you just give a brief overview of what Lean is and Lean thinking? I think we hear derivations of it now rather than the origin.
Well, I suppose I've taken for me, the two key things in Lean that really matter to me and that I take and apply in whatever problem or organisation I'm working with is respect for people and continuous improvement. As Esther said, the whole don't try to jump to perfection, but let's just get there iteration, let's get there in steps, really matters. And the respect for people is, nobody understands the problem better than the people who are involved in working in whatever it is, or the customers who are needing the service. So talking to them, listening to them, involving them. You are going to, when you get to the end of your what's my problem and here's my solution, you're going to find it infinitely easier to implement whatever that solution is if you involved everybody on the way through. I was looking up, John Shook is one of the sort of famous Lean gurus, the head of the Lean Enterprise Institute, and I was looking at his quotes this morning, and one of them is, Lean isn't Lean if it doesn't involve everybody. And I thought, yeah, that's it. But flowing value to the customer, if I had to say what Lean, another way of looking at Lean is making sure you flow value.
So I suppose there is like a sort of model and a structure there, although like I said, I always try and not get too caught up in that, and then when you ask, I thought, God, I wonder if I can even remember what the model is. But it starts off at the define stage, which we've kind of talked about, around really understanding what your problem is, and then it's about measuring, so capturing that baseline data. That can be a difficult step, because I think I've seen projects that get totally crippled at that stage because they're trying to capture absolutely everything, or there's nothing available, and quite often in the public sector that can be a real challenge. Then it's analysing the data. What does it tell you in relation to what your initial problem statement is, implementing a solution, and then the control phase, which is the bit again, and a lot of projects ends up getting forgotten about because everybody wants to go into the next exciting thing. The control phase is really around looking at the change that's actually happened. Have you seen the improvements? And then potentially you would go back and kind of look back around, picking up Jean's point around the continuous improvement side of things. I think something like Lean can be quite overwhelming, because if you were starting off totally fresh, that is like a massive toolkit of like hundreds of different things that you can pick and choose from. And one of the things that we did at North Ayrshire was we had a kind of change checklist where we picked out some of the tools and just said, well, these are the tools that we like to use at each of the different stages, and that made it much more manageable for anybody coming into the team, rather than like a huge thing that you think, well, where do I even start with that? And with any of these approaches, you always get your favourite, and it's the same with service design. I've got my favourite tools that I tend to use with all clients. And I don't know, maybe sometimes it's worth revisiting the tools that you don't tend to use and to keep things fresh, but I think everybody's got their preference.
One of the simplest tools that I use, it's my comfort zone tool, is, and it came up in the service design course I went on to, is the 5 whys, which isn't strictly 5 whys, but just keep asking why. And it's never the top answer, but why and why and why, and until you really, really expose what's the bottom root cause that is causing the problem, or the lack of, the lack of solution, or whatever.
It's interesting, and kind of to echo the bit on data that you mentioned there when you were both talking as well. I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment that talks about how sort of Spotify really got a lot of people into the actually knowing what people listen to, so a bit like albums and books, you never really knew what they're listening to, and by streaming music, we now have actual data about what people are listening to and what songs on an album, for example, they're listening to. Whereas in the world of literature, there still isn't prolific enough reading and Kindle and stuff like that. So they never know actually how many books people buy versus read. So people don't read every book they buy. So they were sort of deriving it to the music is the person you are and the book is the person you want to be. And it was quite a nice observation of sort of what data's really been available, so even with a product, when you go and buy it, it doesn't necessarily mean you take it home and use it. Whereas, that digital element really, and instant data feedback on a process gives you that actually what are people are doing and actually what are they doing.
That's really interesting. And I'm amazed that Amazon haven't found a way to, and perhaps they have in the background, commoditize that. Because I'm sure they're working, and there must be somebody working on it at Amazon.
So I guess, what challenges do organizations face when implementing continuous improvement? So we're talking about sort of, that test and learn bit, but, what challenges do they face once you then start down the path of applying some of these tools and techniques?
Let's go first this time, Esther.
So, probably a number of things, like time and resource. I think there's always a challenge around being able to deliver all the change that an organisation is looking to change, and I think making sure that your resources are in the right place. So that kind of links back to what I was saying about, if you understand what your business problem is and what the gap is and what you think the value of the project is, and it then makes it a bit easier for you to prioritise. I think there is pressure to deliver, and then that tends to squeeze the time available, and you then see, one of my bugbears is user research being dropped. So quite often I think you see, particularly if there's a kind of top-down pressure, is that, well, we already know what our customers want, so why don't we just go on and deliver it? Whereas I kind of think that user research is one of the most important bits, and it avoids you going down the pet project route and doing things because people have made an assumption about things. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is people underestimating how long it actually takes to deliver quality change. And I think that the temptation is to cut steps out and get to the implementation, but by doing that, quite often you're actually sacrificing the quality of the product that you get at the end, so you don't get the value because you sacrificed some of the effort. So I would say that that's probably that, and the lack of data, I would say, is the biggest challenge. So especially in the public sector, quite often you go and there's just absolutely no data at all. So you're then kind of making judgments in the dark, or you have to take quite a bit of time gathering baseline data. And over my career, I've probably tried every approach for gathering data, from bringing consultants in and spending thousands and thousands to 5-bar gates. And no matter what approach I've tried, there's always somebody that doesn't agree at the end. So I tend to be quite pragmatic about gathering baseline data.
Yeah. I think that's the lack of data, or the ability. It's even just a willingness to think that I need the data. When you're trying to get continuous improvement, it's people not jumping on the, oh well, I assume that's not working because, and let's fix it this way. Really get data first. Or if you're stating your problem up front and going, this is the problem. It's like, how would we know? Or this is what I think I want to achieve. And even if you've got that agreed with the customer, is thinking about, well, how would we know that we had then delivered it or achieved it? I think one of the other cultural changes we definitely have in organizations that I've worked in is one of trust. So managers like to micromanage because they get paid more because they knew the answer and that's what they want to do. So they want to tell their teams what the answer is. And it takes a different kind of management to work in this kind of environment where you're expecting, wanting, hoping that people will be bringing their skill set and their understanding of the problem. And also you want to encourage people to be thinking continuous improvement themselves all the time. And listening to their customer and bringing that in and thinking, oh, so what could we do or how could we do that without needing to be told. So trying to bake in that everyone is empowered, everyone is enabled is a lifetime work and a place where some organisations are a lot further behind others from the starting point.
I think that empowerment idea is a really good point, Jean, because I think you see that as well in organisations that are trying to shift from a waterfall delivery to a more agile type delivery. Yeah. And they're quite keen to embrace the idea around agile, but it's really, really hard to let go of that control. And so quite often the reporting structure and the meetings and the boards and everything that are set up are still set up in quite a traditional way. And you then have that mismatch between people wanting to move quickly and the agile approach. And that's quite difficult if everything has to be escalated up the line in order to make decisions. And sometimes you see that in workshops as well, where people send the right people along because they've maybe got the knowledge, but they've not necessarily got the delegated authority. And it's then quite difficult in workshops to be able to make decisions, and it slows the process down and can make it more difficult to actually deliver the change.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would try not, in my past experience, because I'm semi-retired now, if you're in that situation where you've got the right people in the room to discuss the problem, but they're not the decision maker, you have to have the decision maker there at the end of the day, where the people can go, this is what we think we've learned, this is what we want to do. You can't hold it up where you then go away for a week or 2 weeks and finally get them involved. You ideally want to do it on the spot. What about the audience though? Have you had examples of, in the places that you've worked, good involvement where you felt you've been empowered to problem solve or empowered to deliver better services for your users? What do you think? You're all very
quiet. I'll speak up then. I feel that in general for myself, I feel empowered and want to do the best for whoever it is I'm working for or what the project is. But the reason I signed up for this talk and the others within the schedule are because I have an interest in Agile, but there's only lip service paid to it. As Esther mentioned, it's not an easy switch. It's like a cultural change, isn't it, to go from how we used to work in the past with the waterfall methodology and then switching to the Agile method. Even doing daily stand-ups is, you can see it's a pain for some people rather than something which is going to aid them and help them with what they're doing. So it is hard.
Practice.
Yeah, unless you've got, it's a culture change in some places.
But to go to another John Shute quote, start somewhere and improve, or something like that. Start somewhere and learn from experience. So don't let it stop you trying to get better. That's good.
And I think that the challenge, Stuart said, is good that you're sort of flagging this kind of stuff, is the nature of technology has changed towards continuous improvement. So if organizations aren't embracing that, they're not going to get the same value back, basically. I know one of the projects I was working on was very much working with local authorities and sort of the procurement function, because they're set up to buy a thing. But actually the best technology is co-designed and co-developed, because then you're bringing in all the learnings rather than that, I think I know what you want, there you go. And everybody goes, that wasn't really what we wanted. So a lot of that council was trying to unpick what was old school thinking, even from within the legal process, if you see what I mean. and effectively they're the gates that prevent that culture change effectively. You know, people use the audit won't sign that off, legal won't sign that off as the kind of barriers to allowing you to sort of do these sort of things.
That's interesting, because I'm doing some work at the moment with someone who, an organisation that wants a new CRM system, and they're going to apply for a grant for it, but they want to do work with me first to work out what the right one might be and what they actually need from a CRM system. And as Esther said so eloquently before, what problem is it we're trying to solve? We don't need a CRM system. We have business problems, and that might be the answer, or might not, who knows, but let's see. And she's going, okay, so what am I going to put in the grant? Because I can't say I want to buy, you know, Salesforce or whatever, because I don't know yet. So the world around us is not necessarily set up in a way that allows this continuous improvement that we're trying to embrace. Good point, Jo.
So I guess, you know, and some of what we're talking about is almost like that current state of how organizations are, what rules are in place, what kind of policies are in place. How important is it to understand that sort of lay of the land when you start on a bit of work with an organization?
I think it's important to a certain extent, but it's also quite good as an external person being able to challenge it. Because again, like as you mentioned, I have had that legal say or procurement say, and I think sometimes it's quite good to be able to challenge it or bring experience that you've got from elsewhere. I think all of those things can be used as blockers or ways to actually slow things down, although obviously it's important with procurement and things to make sure you're doing things in a compliant way. But I think organisations do get stuck in the way that they've always done things, and even the internal processes could be doing a bit of leaning and a bit of service design a lot of the time. No, but quite often we focus on our external customers, but there's quite often huge improvements to be made internally with the way that the organisations operate.
Yeah, I did I've done a lot of work with customers, but I've done a lot of mine, maybe probably more work with internal processors and internal customers, and thinking about, it's thinking about that whole flow though. So don't just never optimize one department or one bit of an organization or one bit of a process. Always look outside that, because otherwise you're at severe risk of just sub-optimizing this little bit over here, and it should never have been there at all. In fact, this department should have been removed completely, because you should have joined the ones either side up instead, or something like that. So I'm back to, am I answering Jo's question? I think looking at the bigger picture, looking at the context, understanding how things fit together is a really important part of what we're doing. And yeah, that's an extension of the current situation. So Esther pointed out earlier how much you need to understand the current problem. You need to understand what problem you're trying to solve, and you need to collect data to evidence it. And you also then need to look at the context and all the other things which are will have constraints or influences, barriers to letting you move forward. And then decide whether they need fixed first, or whether you can work around them, or whether you just accept that that's how they are. Which in turn then brings another challenge for implementing continuous improvement in any organisation, is how to prioritise what thing do I fix first. And if you unpick a problem and you go, well, actually, there's a lot going on over there that's making it impossible for me to fix my problem here, or to deliver better service to the customer because it's rubbish over there. Maybe we really ought to be looking at that first. And that comes down to trying to understand what really matters, which then circles you back to something that's very important, is understanding what's your organisation about and what's its purpose. Because if you can't start thinking about how the service you're trying to deliver or the problem that you're trying to solve relates to that big picture purpose, then you're at risk of making a mess of wrong decisions. So always have, before you start looking at all, always understand the purpose.
Yeah, nice. I think there's also the element of, in that understanding the current situation, sometimes, you know, how you were saying at the end when you finish, there's always people who aren't happy or aren't whatever. You've got that richer understanding of who are your yes people, who are the naysayers, who's on board, because, you know, you're not always going to persuade everybody that something's needed, but at least you can start the journey, and that doesn't necessarily mean you as the person working on the project needs to do it. That might be an escalation, or it might be that actually quite often, in fact, internal comms is very poor. So a lot of it's then, how do you pepper the change, remove the fear of change from groups as well, because, you know, often people think it's going to be more complicated, or their roles are at risk ultimately in bigger organizations. So it can kind of get a little bit of who's your supporters, who you know, where you then get into racy kind of territory, like, am I really asking the right people the right questions?
No, I mean, definitely, I think that internal buy-in's key, but again, like, I try and be quite pragmatic. Like, I find if I've not got buy-in at a certain element, like at a really senior level for doing a certain part, I would probably try and work around that and try and deliver something to then kind of build that trust and almost kind of put your money where your mouth is. Sometimes I think, like, when I work in councils, if you waited until everybody agreed on everything, even at a really senior level, you would never get anything done. So sometimes, even although you can see, actually, we should maybe be changing things here, so it's that balance around, actually, it's maybe a bit easier to do this. You're not going to get all the value, but if you get some of the value, and you can then actually start like kind of getting a bit of momentum. And I think then if people start to see that you can maybe remove some of the fear, you can deliver some of the benefit, and it then becomes a lot easier, particularly if you do have to escalate and it's maybe going to come down to a chief exec's decision or somebody at a really senior level, they're much more likely to be on your side if you've already got a proven track record of delivery, rather than just go in like with a totally fresh business case. So I totally agree with all the, like, map everything end to end, get everybody on board. But like I say, I think one of my key things is about getting stuff done. So if I can't get the absolute optimal, I'll find ways to work around it to at least get some improvement.
Yeah, definitely. Has anybody got any questions on what we've been talking about so far? Go on.
When you're consultant and you mentioned your favorite tools, you'll have your playbook for the work that's required. Do you get to, more often or not, work through that playbook of those actions and tools, that standardization of that methodology, or do you find that you have to tailor it quite a bit to suit the situation or the products?
It depends. So a lot of the time, yes, but the user research is always a really hard one, and it is one that organisations will put pressure on for you to cut corners, or I suppose it depends. It depends on where they are in the level of maturity in relation to, like, service design. But quite often when people are looking at the different tools, user research is one of the ones that folk will think, well, do we really need to do that? We could just analyse their complaints or whatever, maybe do secondary user research. So that's one of the areas that can be quite difficult. And one of the things that I'm always checking, like when I'm taking on a bit of work, is what's the resource that they've actually got available? What are their expectations as to how quickly they're expecting to deliver this change? And that will kind of give me a bit of a steer as to how realistic they're actually being about the discovery work and doing some of the analysis. I quite like process mapping, so I tend to do that in conjunction with sort of journey mapping. So that doesn't always sit that well with service design. It tends to be maybe a bit more focused around, like, numbers. I do think it can be a useful tool to have in your back pocket to try and convince more senior people that is the right route to go down, because you might have a lot of the softer stuff around, this is what our users have told us, and this is why we should do it. But actually, if you can then say, but it would also save the business money, or it would make it, so if you've actually got some tangible stuff in there as well, it can actually be a really good backup to your user research. So the process mapping's one, probably one of my favourite tools in conjunction with journey mapping. So I would say that I've got a number of favourite tools, and then I've probably got a bare minimum that I think you really can't do the process unless you've got these tools in place.
Yeah, my favourite and most used tool is value stream mapping, which is process mapping, but very focused on mapping the value and mapping the information flow. And then that's also it's journey mapping too, if it's about a user. So what's it called? What's that trendy word that came in? Blueprints? Is that the?
Sarah's blueprints.
Blueprints came along as the trendy thing about 5 or 10 years ago.
So as a result of mergers, basically. So it was mergers and acquisitions. So there's something like, oh, we need blueprints for the new organisation.
You know, I find blueprints quite a difficult tool to use, particularly if it's an organisation that's quite new to service design. I find blueprints can be quite difficult for people to get their head around. Like, I know that when you talk about, and if anybody doesn't know the blueprint, you kind of talk about front stage, backstage, and you can give examples. You know, if you're in a restaurant, what happens, like you know, when you get greeted and then somebody like takes your food order. Backstage is like what happens in the kitchen and maybe ordering provisions and things. I find people find that quite hard to translate into their actual business sense, and it's only a tool I tend to use if the organisation that I'm working with is reasonably mature. I find I've had a couple of workshops where people have really struggled with the blueprint and stuff. So it's quite interesting to hear that's one that you use all the time.
No, I don't.
You don't use it often.
Sorry, it came along. It was kind of trendy, but I think it's all about asking questions and listening, and vaguely, it's not vaguely at all, value stream mapping is quite a precise tool if you're using it, but you're going from the beginning to the customer, the thing that's in the customer's hand, and it's and you can do it. There's lots of, you know, special symbols and special ways of doing it very precisely, following the lean book of how to do a value stream map. But I've just evolved over the years to something pretty simple that anyone can engage with.
Just picking up on the value stuff, the other thing I really like, the value effort mapping. That's probably one of my favourites, is around, you know, is it worth doing? Is it going to deliver value? And then how much effort? Like, I've been working with an organisation that was doing stuff, and I thought, like, why are you actually doing that? Like, you're creating forms that nobody really wants, and actually, like, so one person's filled it in the last year, and you're being distracted on that, when actually you would be better developing some of your minimum viable product stuff into much more sort of user-friendly processes. But they were just kind of blindly doing stuff that was on a list because that's what was available in the old system. So I think that whole value effort thing's sort of really important for me, and I think it's a really good thing to help teams feel included as well, that if they're all voting on what the most valuable things are for the customer, the organisation, they kind of feel that they're getting a say in being able to prioritise their own workload. So that's one of my favourite tools.
Yeah, when you come up to if you're trying to solve a problem or look at opportunities for a new product or something, and you're looking at you said that, mapping the difference between the effort it would take to make this improvement or innovation versus the cost that it would take, that's a good way of then helping you prioritise which ones to try first. In that it is all an experiment, and you're trying and you're learning, and then you're going, no, actually, that didn't work. So one other important thing that I haven't said, neither of us have said, but is important, you're allowed to fail. And you almost have to, well, not almost, you have to accept that not all your experiments are going to succeed. And if the organisation doesn't accept that, that makes it really, really hard, because that makes it really hard to be brave to try out things. It comes back to that trust.
See how we always say that, though? Like, I didn't see many organisations willing to admit that things aren't working.
No.
Once they set on a path, like, once they set on a path, they're on that path, and nobody, very rarely do I see somebody, I've seen it a couple of times, but rarely do I see somebody, even with pilots, like by the time they're running a pilot, they're pretty convinced they're going to roll it out. It's more a kind of first phase. And although everybody talks about it, you know, fail fast and all that, like I don't see many organisations putting their hand up and saying, oh, we've made a mistake, or no, we've made a mistake, but this isn't working, we want to change our approach.
Yeah. And it's framing it into a, what did we learn? So maybe failure is the wrong word to use. It's just, here was a learning experiment. What did we learn? Now what do we do next? And that's better. But
I suppose that picks up on what you were saying earlier, though, Jane, is that you then get caught up in the whole cycle, particularly like in public sector, around procurement and what are you buying, and the language, like, are people going to give you funding for a learning activity? No, they're wanting to be implementing something that's actually going to deliver the benefit. So that whole, and I know that some of the work that the Scottish Government have done around CivTech's really trying to change that that mindset around, you know, collaboration with suppliers and doing things differently, and going to your suppliers with a problem instead of going to them with a solution. But I think that more traditional organisations have still got quite a way to go in relation to that.
Kim, can I ask you, Kim at the beginning introduced herself and said she's a service designer. So where are you in what you teach? Because you're teaching at Dundee. What are you teaching on experiments and permission to fail, or how do you frame that?
Yeah, so we teach at the Service Design Academy the Professional Development Award in Service Design, which is where we take individuals through that service design approach and mindset, as well as a kind of design process. And through that, we teach that kind of mindset of like exactly what you talk about, that kind of feel forward. But it's more about that kind of through like that continual iterations. We talk about that iterative process throughout the design process. But it's more framing it in that place. I think you maybe touched on it both a little bit as well while you were talking about, as you go through that process, it's that continual reframing. So every time you learn something new, you reframe what you think you knew about whatever it is that you're looking at. So whether that be a problem space, a problem statement, a user, an interaction, a service in itself, or an organisation, you're continually learning through that service design process. So it's not about that sort of feeling, so to speak. It's about kind of just learning and reframing and actually changing your perspective as you go along. So that's kind of how we work within that space. We also look at prototyping within that space as well, around those kind of creating ways to test your assumptions, but then also to test those kind of new possibilities as well within that space. We also work with organisations, so we see exactly what you're talking about there around that, the acceptance of the process being different than how people typically work. It can be difficult for organisations to accept that, because essentially you're holding a mirror up to organisations when you come into them and introduce that kind of new methodology. Especially when you're doing things like you talk about mapping and things as well, you're kind of holding a mirror up to them and saying, this is what you look like. And they're like, no, it's not. That's not what we look like. That's not what we look like from where we're standing. So that can be really challenging. But I think we always try to build in a first day of working with organisations who are trying to start that service design journey and building that mindset of a day where we really just start to challenge them in that space and let them have those critical conversations. So, right, you three people, you all deliver the same service. Well, how do you do that? So why don't you three of you go and map that out and tell us what that's like? And then the three of them come back and say, oh, well, we all do the same job and do the same thing, but actually we all think it works differently, and we all think that someone else owns this part. Or so it's about that kind of just opening up those minds. And exactly, it's a long journey. It's not, we always position that as well. It's not about it just, you'll come away from doing training or doing a project and it'll be done. It's a long journey for organisations, but yeah, sorry, I've probably sidetracked a little bit there as well. But
no, but you raised, I think then, so I think, so my continuous improvement is I'm going to stop talking about failure and just talk about reframing, because it's a better word. I think there's an element of, there's an element of, when you're prototyping, would you ever reach the point where you just completely bin the whole thing? Probably not. You'd probably try and grow and develop and retweak, but maybe. But you mentioned something else there about getting those three people who follow the same process and probably find out that they do it all differently, or that there's a whole The power of getting people in a room together or now around an online mural board together is infinite. It's enormous. I can't underestimate how much you need to get people together in a room at the beginning when you're at that understand the current situation stage, because just the exercise of them listening to each other about what their organization does and developing their own understanding of what their organization does had so much value. You could walk away at that stage as a consultant and they would still have, gained enormous value from realizing that there was a hole that nobody filled, or that two teams were doing the same thing, the same thing, or just, it's always eye-opening for people. I have never done that. And without people at the end going, wow, I didn't know that. Another favourite tool, get people together.
I think even from a relationship building point of view, particularly when you've got like front office, back office, and we used to see that a lot in the council, where people would complain at that contact centre, and actually once you got them together with the contact centre and they got a better understanding as to what their jobs were, sometimes they were actually quite astounded as to the challenges that the contact centre faced. And there's quite often never really the opportunity provided for people in different departments to actually get together. And one of the things that I'm seeing with one of the organisations that I'm working with at the moment is that there's some processes that nobody actually understands the whole end-to-end process. Everybody only does their own wee bit and doesn't actually understand where the information is coming from, how it even gets in. So they can see issues with the work that they're doing, but they don't really understand it in the wider context. It makes the workshops a lot more challenging, actually, and actually making sure that you've got the right people around the table. But I think that the output's so much richer.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Cool. I could keep talking about this ad infinitum. But I guess, does anybody else have any questions? Even if it's related to how you get involved in service design, pathways into good learning points. If any of you guys have any questions on that, please do ask away. Obviously, the course that Kim runs.
We'll let Kim answer.
Cool. I'll assume there's no questions. What I might do, I'm going to stop the recording just in case that